Well, Paul Finebaum thinks the Pac-12 will be gone, done, kaput, ended, completely off the map by 2026. Is he right? That depends.
You are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with our media rights free and beloved Conference of Champions. Like, comment, subscribe, please, and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show. We've got that to discuss that we talked about in the open. A big game, should the Pac-12 be promoting it, and a look at the Week 3 non-conference TV schedule, which is so much closer than you think. We have like 10 Saturdays left before college football is here. What a time to be alive. So, Paul Finebaum was talking. He's a longtime college football commentator at ESPN. I think he has his own show as well. I can't say I've seen it, but I did see these comments, and I, as a host of Locked On Pac-12, let's just say they caught my attention. So, he was asked whether or not the Pac-12 can continue to exist. He said, quote, "I don't think so. I don't know how it can. The situation is so fragile right now," he added. "The leadership is better than it was. Low bar. It's still not very good. Oof. Oof. You hear that, George K? Paul Finebaum's not a fan. And, I think you give the new commissioner, George Kliavkoff, a pass because maybe a year and a half ago, his predecessor literally ran this thing into the ground. Okay, all's fair in love and war. But he's had enough time, and I think you have to give him a failing grade." Boy, very hot and cold on George Kliavkoff here. The leadership is not very good. You got to give George Kliavkoff a pass, but you got to give him a failing grade. Last time I checked, pass and fail are opposites. Paul Finebaum does not agree. Anyway, I found that to be particularly curious here. But is he right? Could the Pac-12 actually cease to exist by 2026? First and foremost, there is precedent in the history of college sports for organizations that we call conferences to cease to exist. The Big East, once upon a time, had football. That does not exist anymore. Long, long, long ago, the Southwest Conference existed. That was a thing. It is not a thing anymore. So it's not as if it's never happened. Now, does it happen super often? No. The WAC once upon a time, the Western Athletic Conference, which now has FCS football back, and they've partnered with the ASUN to form, a conference alliance there because neither conference had a bunch of teams in it. So they've kind of, merged into being one football conference there. They might go FBS one day. That'll be something to talk about way down the line. But it's interesting nonetheless. The WAC once upon a time had big-time FBS football. It was headlined by Boise State. When Boise State was making their Cinderella run to the Fiesta Bowl in 2007 or into the top 5 and top 10, they beat Georgia once upon a time in a non-conference game. Yeah, I had to let that one simmer because that is a real thing that happened in college football. Imagine that today. Boise State beating Georgia. Pretty crazy. Anyway, they once upon a time played in the WAC. The WAC then decided, nope, we're not having football anymore. The WAC has since brought football back, but they're at the FCS level, not the FBS level. So it's not as if it is impossible here. Now, the matter of whether or not the conference could actually cease to exist, unfortunately for the Pac-12, as a conference, does not fall in the hands of the Pac-12. There is no media deal situation that I can foresee that would cause Oregon and Washington to one day turn down an offer from the Big Ten. Now, I have long held the belief that the Big 12 does not have the power on its own to make the move to tank the Pac-12. Because if they did, that would have happened by now. And schools, technically could end up there depending on what happens with the media deal. Arizona and Colorado have said openly, we're going to wait and see what happens there. I think that's a perfectly fair and reasonable thing to do. See what the media deal is. As long as it's close, they'll stay in the Pac-12. That's what they want to do. But they could get forced to go over there. They're not exactly chomping at the bit to go to the Big 12, or they would have gone by now because they've had all this time to leave. They want to stay in the Pac-12, could get forced to the Big 12. The Big 10 is different. Oregon and Washington, I think we all agree, want to go to the Big 10. Now, Finebaum was speaking in kind of generalities here, talking about, I just don't see how it can exist in this framework, right? That was the quote, is the situation is so fragile right now. I don't think so in regards to whether or not it can exist. I don't know how it can. That's more of a sentiment than a specific path, which is what I'm going to chart here for how the Pac-12 would actually see its potential demise one day. And that move would start, as I have long said here on the show, with the Big Ten. The Big Ten has the authority. They have the power, they have the money, they have the bargaining power, they have the reputation, they have the schools, they have everything they need to tank the Pac-12 anytime they feel like it. Oregon and Washington would almost certainly go, and Cal and Stanford, who I know everyone thinks they don't care about athletics, they do, just not maybe as much as other schools, but we know they care about academics, and academics are a big deal in the Big Ten. You got some big-time schools over there. Go look at Michigan and what they do academically. You know who the Big Ten wants to add? Notre Dame. Is that a good school? Last time I checked, the answer is yes. Northwestern exists in the Big Ten. Some of the biggest research institutions in the entire country are over there. So even if you look at the Bay Area schools and say they don't care about athletics to go enough to go over there, well, here's the other consideration that you are then saying they do care about, and the boxes are checked in the Big Ten unequivocally. And they had a historical relationship while they were in the Pac-12, and still technically currently do, with USC and UCLA for a reason. And when you go down, the list of the best academic schools in the Pac, Stanford and Cal are probably 1 and 2. USC and UCLA are pretty darn close. Washington is in that mix as well, but those were the premier institutions there. And I don't think aligning with USC and UCLA is something that Stanford and Cal would feel like, oh no, we would never do that. Not after what they did to us. Like, at the end of the day, all these schools, they are united right now, as we have heard many, many times from presidents and athletic directors in the conference and whatnot. They're aligned in trying to keep the conference together at this point in time. But everybody's got a price. Everybody's got a point where they say, okay, yeah, I'll go. Dustin Johnson said, nope, I'm not going to the Live Tour. Not even for $100 million. You offered me how much money? Oh, okay, yeah, I'm going over there. Everybody's got a price at some point in time. And the thing with the Big Ten is if they decide to come further west, which could totally make sense. Like if you want to be the most national conference in the country, the Big Ten has potentially options on that front. Now, would the money work out perfectly? Would schools be able to, pull their weight? TV ratings wise, would it be worth it? That's for the conference and media executives to figure out. But if you're the Big Ten and you want to be the biggest and best conference in America, you have options to expand both east and west, right? Now that depends on what would happen potentially with, the ACC and the grant of rights and whether or not schools can actually get out of that. It looks like the answer to that is no at this point in time. But for the Pac-12, I think the legal jargon of the media deal that, look, I don't know when it comes down. Don't ask me to try and guess and whatnot, because I have no idea. You have no idea. We stopped, going for a potential ticking time bomb until it explodes and, goes off, but in a positive way. I don't know why I went with that metaphor when I was trying to say something uplifting. But anyway, we don't know when that is going to drop. But when it does, I think the language of, how schools could potentially get out of it or how long the grant of rights is for, I think all that stuff matters. So we'll get back around to answering Paul's fundamental question, which is, hey, is the Pac-12 actually doomed to fail here in just a sec? But now that summer is here, Birddog shorts are what you need to go through summer. Whether you're a hiker, whether you're a golfer, whether you're a jogger, whether you're a swimmer, you can use your Birddog shorts literally anywhere and everywhere. Their stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. Birddog shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They fit better than regular shorts too, which are made of a stiff, restricting cotton. Birddog shorts blow right through that with their cloud knit fabric that look like khaki shorts, but stretches so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your bird dogs off this summer, we promise you, so go get your next order today. Second segment sip, second segment breath. Was running out of oxygen there. The end of the ad read. We don't want that. That would be, boy, no bueno. So, the question here, would the Pac-12 be gone by 2026? Well, if the Pac-12 media deal gets signed and it starts in 2024, and by 2026 it were gone, the path for it being by that particular year, again, depends on the language of, the media deal and the grant of rights and whether or not Oregon and Washington could get out of it. But he's saying, by 2026, it'll just cease to exist. Like, it just won't be there. And whether or not that could happen, that feels more like the Big Ten would have to make a move right now, because the Big Ten is clearly not in a hurry to expand further. Because I think the most likely course of action here is the Big Ten, kind of gives this West Coast thing a trial run with USC and UCLA. They work out all the kinks. They figure out the logistics. They understand, how to incorporate the schools, how to set schedules, how to do, all that sort of stuff. And then at a later point in time, they decide whether or not they want to go, further westward with Oregon, Washington, Stanford, and Cal, who they could add, by the way. This is, speaking even greater to the Big Ten's position of authority in all these realignment talks. They could add Oregon, Washington, Stanford, and Cal for less than full media rights shares, and all of those schools would say yes. Because if a Big Ten share, like if a full share is, I believe it's $75 million, whatever it is, if you add those schools at a reduced rate, you could still probably get them $40 million a year. Like that's just my guess. I haven't negotiated these contracts before, but based on how other additions that are not quite as valuable yet early in a contract, like take the G5 additions in the Big 12, I believe they're going to be earning somewhere in like the teens, right, per school. So like 15, 16, 17, I forget what the actual number is, but if the number is around half, or maybe just a little bit over half, then for the Big Ten, less than half would be like, or around or just over half would be like in the $30 to $40 million range. Does anyone think the Pac-12 is going to get that right now? They could get 30. Could they get 40? Absolutely not. Like that, I think we can agree that's pretty much been taken off the table at this point. And getting to 30, I think would be a successful area for the Pac-12 to land financially with their new deal here. So I think it would depend on the language. I think the move would have to come from the Big Ten. If the SEC ever decided they wanted to go west, I know Oregon and Washington would certainly take that offer most likely as well, but I've never gotten the sense that the SEC cares about anybody outside of the South. So I think the Big Ten is the conference really to watch there. And then those dominoes falling would probably trigger other moves of, the Four Corner schools might take up the Big 12 on their offer to go join. And then Oregon State and Washington State would be scrapping and clawing to find a home, or at least that's how it seems at this point in time, if those dominoes were to fall. But that was kind of the objection I had to Finebaum's comment. Not, could the Pac-12 survive, or could the Pac-12 not exist one day? Yeah, there's a realistic world in which that happens. But don't just talk about it vaguely, like have an idea. What could it be? What could it look like? What would have to happen? And so that's kind of how I see that scenario. But that quote definitely caught my eye. Always curious as to your guys' comments. And any girls out there watching the show as well. Drop it in the YouTube comments or hit me up on Twitter at smalls_55 or at LO_Pac-12. This one came from Bud as we shift back to the football side of things, not just realignment. We're talking about both here. Bud says, LOP12 mailbag. With Oregon and Washington being the upcoming Pac-12's big Birddogs, look at the plug. Look at the plug here from my guy Bud, who's an everydayer, shouting out the sponsor, Birddogs, who we appreciate very much here at the network. Goodness gracious, look at that. That's the sort of crossover appeal that I think sets us apart here at Locked On. That's fantastic. Well done, Bud. Kudos to you. Anyway, with Oregon and Washington being the upcoming Pac-10's big Birddogs, should the league set a fixed week for the Oregon-Washington rivalry football game to 1, maximize the exposure, and 2, allow the loser adequate time to recover in the rankings? Fans of non-Oregon and Washington teams, of which I think we all know at this point I am an Oregon fan, might not like my answer here, but to me, it's a pretty clear and obvious yes. When you look at every conference over the years, there are marquee matchups that draw an audience outside of the geographical footprint in which the conference exists. Now that's going to, happen even more now that you have the LA schools in the Big Ten, Texas, Oklahoma, and the SEC, and yada yada yada. But there are always games. I think a conference sometimes can not be defined, but kind of be known for what happens in these games. The Big 12 is going to miss Texas and Oklahoma. Yes, they're going to miss the Red River Showdown too, because that is a big-time game, a big-time rivalry that everyone wants to watch between big brands with great fan bases that play awesome games and that are usually pretty highly ranked as well. So in terms of television products, your top schools going forward for the Pac-12 are Oregon, Washington, and Utah, probably in that order. I know this past season, Utah was basically identical to Washington in terms of average TV viewership per game. Over the course of the last several years, if you average it out, Washington has still got a bigger draw. They're in, I believe, a more valuable media market in Seattle compared to Salt Lake City. But still, it's not as if Utah has no value there. But the thing that would make me inclined to agree with Bud's proposition here, and he's implying with the question of, should you highlight this game the way the Big 12 did the Red River Showdown, the way the Big 10 does of, the game between Ohio State and Michigan, the way the SEC has done with a variety of rivalries over the years, whether that's the Iron Bowl, Georgia, Florida. I don't know how they haven't put Georgia and Bama in a protected rivalry. I hope they do that in the next cycle, because what are we doing here? But I think that that's something that is incredibly valuable for a conference to have, a recognizable pair of teams that are going to play a game that has major implications and is also going to be a little heated. Like, they call it the border war for a reason. Washington and Oregon, not particularly fond of one another. And that adds interest, intrigue. ACC, by the way. What's the ACC matchup we've all been watching our entire lives? It's in college basketball, but it's Duke, North Carolina. Like, you're trying to create the best television product possible all the time. You know how you do that? Rivalries. Over the last, I believe, 2 or 3 seasons, I saw this in, I think it was The Athletic a while back. Don't exactly remember. But over the last couple of seasons, the most viewed college football regular season games in the Pac-12 that don't include USC and UCLA are all rivalry games. Oregon, Washington, Cal, Stanford, Oregon State. Those are the 5 most viewed games in the regular season amongst Pac-12 schools exclusively. And I think having that matchup is good for the conference. It creates excitement and intrigue. So I think giving that game, and look, maybe I'm off the reservation here as an Oregon fan. I know my Washington fans out there who listen, of which there's several of you, and I very much appreciate that. People might say, oh, you're biased, you just want Oregon to do this, that. Like, Oregon's going to get a pretty good TV rating no matter when or who they play, but it's amplified when they go against Washington. And in my purview, again, let me know if you think I'm completely off base and just biased here, but that is the marquee matchup that people know and recognize outside of the Pac-12 would want to watch and would have the sort of big stakes that you need to have it be kind of that marquee game. So pitching it as such, yeah, I completely agree. Now, as for the timing component, which is interesting. As for the timing component, I again agree with what you're proposing here, Bud. The Red River Showdown has always been earlier in the season. Now, that doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but if you're the Pac-12, you kind of have two options here. Right now, Oregon and Washington, play every year because they're in the, former Pac-12 North, but they play at different points in the season. So last year, Washington and Oregon played in the third to last week of, each team had 2 games after they played at Autzen Stadium. This year, they play in week 7, so it varies like that. Now, Ohio State and Michigan are a rivalry in that they play each other in the last week of the year. And I think those are the best ways to do it. Either set it up so that matchup occurs early enough in the season so that either team could potentially recover, give themselves playoff contending opportunities and, rack up wins and that sort of stuff, or have it be at the end of the year. But I don't think that that's going to happen because Oregon's got the game formerly known as the Civil War and Washington's got the Apple Cup. I think that those rivalries probably stay as the ones that they play in the final week of the regular season because of the tradition there, and I like that. So I think, frankly, the timing of where they have it this year, both teams will play their non-conference slates. Both teams will play a couple conference games. Both teams will have a bye, and then they do it. I think that's a really good way to do it, and I think that's going to be a really, really awesome game up in Seattle this year. So I think that is a good idea for the Pac-12 going forward. And look, people who listen to the show know, in no way, shape, or form am I anti-Utah. Oregon and Utah have played a lot of big games over the years. Washington and Utah going forward can play a lot of big games with big-time ramifications. But the missing element there with Utah, frankly, is unless it's with USC, they're too nice. Like Utah fan, I love Utah fans, genuinely. I live amongst a lot of them here. They're fantastic. I went to the Pac-12 championship game in 2021. I watched my Ducks get absolutely blasted off the field. I could not have had more fun being around those Utah fans. But Utah doesn't have a rivalry with Oregon or Washington, or frankly any other team in the Pac-12 the way that Oregon and Washington do. Doesn't mean there aren't matchups where it's like, oh, I really want to beat them, I want to do this, that, but it's nothing like Utah's big rival there is BYU. Okay, if BYU were in the conference, okay, now you could be talking about a game that should get the sort of publicity, pomp, and circumstance that the border war would. But ultimately, the animosity between those two schools, those programs, those fan bases, you can't fake that somewhere else. And that's why I'd say Utah is still going to be playing in big games over the next several years. But I don't think that it's on the same level, at least at this point in time. Maybe that could change as Oregon and Washington are. So great question, though. Great question, bud. And again, mailbag questions, always welcome. YouTube comments, or hit me up on Twitter at smalls_55 or at LO_Pac-12. One more sip to get through the last segment of today's show. Got to keep ourselves refreshed. Also calms me down a little bit. Now, sometimes, I get very, very animated, very passionate about it, but hopefully that's why you enjoy the show. All you everydayers out there, and any of you newcomers. So, week 3 in the non-conference slate. I've been talking about weeks 1 and 2 and how great the television lineup is, not just in terms of the matchups, but in terms of the TV schedule, where, week 1, you're going to have games going from 9 a.m. Pacific time to 7:30 Pacific time. National TV matchups, great games, good brands to go against one another. Week 2, a lot of the same stuff. Week 3 is a little bit slimmer. It's a little bit slimmer. Now, doesn't mean there aren't interesting matchups here. There's future Pac-12 member, fingers crossed, San Diego State going to Corvallis to play Oregon State at 12:30 Pacific time on FS1. Arizona State takes on reigning Mountain West champ Fresno State at 7:30 Pacific time, also on FS1. Interesting game there because that game is in Tempe. And again, an opportunity for kind of a marquee win after they play Oklahoma State the previous week. When is that first big win going to come for Kenny Dillingham? Well, we don't know. You don't know. That's why you play the games. That's why it's exciting. But a win against Fresno State would be, I'd say not insignificant for ASU, given how their season went a year ago. And then for the third straight week, talk about the Deion effect. Colorado wasn't on national TV as much last year. They were early in the season against TCU, but then as the year went on, that kind of waned. But right now, all three of their non-conference matchups on national TV. Colorado against Colorado State, a Mountain West school that has once upon a time, maybe thrice upon a time, been tossed around as a potential expansion candidate here for the Pac-12. Not super, super high on it, but that game, 7 p.m. Pacific time on ESPN. Just 3 straight weeks of the Buffs on national TV. So Deion's going to be having every opportunity come this fall to showcase his program to as big of an audience as possible and to try to notch a marquee win. I think they'll beat Colorado State. If they can just beat one of TCU and Nebraska, boy, you'd have Boulder a buzzing, even more so than it is right now. Now, the other game that is of interest in week 3 is Washington at Michigan State. And you may remember I talked about this a little while back because the game got moved to Peacock. And this game is going to be on Peacock, not because the Big Ten or network executives are disrespecting Washington, but quite the opposite. They look at Washington, Michigan State as a game people want to watch. I agree. I want to watch it. You probably want to watch it. A lot of other people would want to watch it. It'd be a big early season win for both programs, right? Especially Michigan State after the year they had a year ago. And if Washington wants to get into the playoff, they probably have to win that game. Because going 9-0 in conference play, 10-0 if you include the Pac-12 title game, that's a tall order. That is a tall, tall order with the way the conference is shaping up this year. So likely Washington's playoff hopes on the line in that particular game. Michigan State looking for a signature marquee win, and it'll be on Peacock. It's something to follow. If you didn't hear my take before, I'll just kind of re-summarize a bit. That is indicative of where live sports could be going. Not necessarily will, but this balance that, people get afraid of streaming all the time. But it's here. It's not here as much as it might be one day, but it is getting into the live sports broadcasting space. Streaming services are in a major, major way. And this is one of the biggest, frankly, early dominoes, in addition to Peacock, getting an NFL playoff game. You're going to have an NFL playoff game. That's not on Fox. That's not on CBS. That's not on ESPN. It's going to be on Peacock. It's a wild card game, but it's still a playoff game. And you've got a big-time college football matchup that's streaming only. I am so curious to see how that plays out in the media landscape as time goes on, because that's a matchup that typically you're saying, well, I want to show that to as big of an audience as possible. But what the Big Ten media people are clearly saying, both the Big Ten Conference and the executives, they're saying, we want to normalize people watching big games on streaming, that you need to have these services because there are going to be games and opportunities over here. And a big-time college football game and an NFL playoff game, pretty good way to do that. That game is 2 p.m. Pacific time on Peacock in week 3. I expect Washington to be 2-0 at that point, having played Boise State and Tulsa in the weeks prior. Should be really, really fun. Can't wait for football. I'm so excited. Summer is awesome. I love summer. I would love if the Pac-12 got a media deal too. I'd love if college football started tomorrow. But we're going to get there together one day at a time. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Have a great weekend. And until next time, whenever that is, have a wonderful rest of your day.